Hi, and welcome back. My name is Norman Madaras, and you're listening to Philosophizing with Alain Badiou, a multi-episode podcast in which I present Alain Badiou's philosophical system to a non-specialist audience, or at least to first-year students in philosophy courses or in the humanities. And the difference of my presentation is the delimitation of the context of France and the philosophy practiced and developed therein without going through the Anglo-American filters. So my commitment also is to, give you a rendering of his system as close to the text as possible, as with as little interpretation from my part as possible. Apart from everything else, Alain Badiou is a great teacher. I had the opportunity of studying with him, of learning tremendously with him, and of watching his teaching style, appreciating the clarity. In a completely non-ironic way, I'd like to say that, Badiou's perfectionism in teaching is such that if there were a question to arise, it would be an indication that something in his presentation was not clear enough. This could be an ideal for all to share who enjoy teaching, and particularly who enjoy teaching rational philosophy. So for the first two episodes, we examined the context in which French philosophy developed in the 20th century. I basically stopped at the end of the 1960s, which is a period in which, in some sense, history catches up to theory, meaning that one of the innovations that had been present within the historical sciences, per se, in France ever since the 1930s was the question of discontinuity, the question of ruptures, the question of eventually event. And I commented that May 68 saw, at least in the political sphere and possibly also in the artistic sphere, the substitution of the term revolution by that of event. Surely May 68 was not a revolution. However, something did occur, and its impact spread amongst various of the fields of knowledge production of the times. So there are many things to be discussed. It's an extremely rich period. I suggested, as part of our reading, to examine Badiou's text Adventure of French Philosophy, which is an account, a retrospective account given at the turn of the millennium about the extremely productive period, the extremely innovative and creative period that crossed French intellectual life from, let's say, the early 1930s until the late 1980s. So, the main text that I want to discuss today, and that I'm using as an entry point to what I will maintain is a very simplified, although not simplistic, account of Badiou's system, is Manifesto for Philosophy. Manifesto for Philosophy was published in 1989. It came just a year after the publication of Being an Event, L'être et l'événement, in its original title, at a time when Badiou certainly was not seen as part of the pantheon of philosophers, although he was recognized as someone of considerable weight in the competition, let's say, to substitute the space left open by Michel Foucault, of course, who passed away in 1984, and possibly Gilles Deleuze, who took his retirement in 1987 for reasons related to health, and which represented really a break with his public persona. There would be two other important books published after 87, Leibniz and the Fold, as well as What is Philosophy? Now, what is philosophy, Badiou contends, is somewhat of an answer to Badiou's attachment to philosophy. Without losing track here, without deviating too much, it's important at least to understand what the proposal is in Chapter 1 of Manifesto for Philosophy, to point out that since 68 precisely, philosophy had been gradually eviscerated in France. This corresponds to the post-structuralist moment, which is a term created and used by North American scholars regarding the transformations that occurred in France at that time. Last time I brought up how important a field of study in France was what is called historical epistemology, and particularly through the figure of Alexandre Koyré. Koyré, who was born in Russia and then educated in Germany, but eventually at Göttingen, and then eventually leaving Germany to come to France because of disagreements with his dissertation advisor, who was none other than Edmund Husserl. So we're already seeing a line here of connections between the work that Husserl is doing, the emergence of this field called philosophy. Koyré is not the pioneer, although he's one of the first thinkers. Gaston Bachelard is also very active at the time. And Bachelard and Koyré will share a conviction regarding the nature of the development of the sciences per se, and that is that its history is built upon discontinuities. The notion of discontinuity is thus developed by Koyré, particularly in a series of studies published in the 1930s, late 1930s, called Les Études Galiléennes, Galilean studies, whose main North American reader, would be none other than Thomas Kuhn. And Thomas Kuhn, at the beginning, the preface of the Structure of Scientific Revolutions, lends homage to Koyré. Koyré's work will be read by the philosophers, particularly in the post-World War II period. And therefore, discontinuity as seen in the development of the sciences, and particularly discontinuity as worked upon by certain sciences, will attract a generation of philosophers studying in Paris at the École Normale Supérieure to examine ways in which to exit from phenomenology and existential phenomenology's focus on the subject. Structuralism will join with historical epistemology in some expressions, namely in the work of Georges Canguilhem, or in the work of Michel Foucault, for example, or even Michel Serres. There's really an overlapping of the two, which makes it difficult, in fact, to see what's involved with structuralism and what's involved with structuralism when it reaches philosophy. So let's say that from a philosophical angle, as I said last time, structuralism is the philosophical enterprise to organize the fact that social sciences, or the humanities, as well as the pure and applied sciences, produced a number of extremely significant concepts, radically novel in their form. One of them, of course, is the unconscious. And the unconscious itself in terms of a dynamic structure producing consciousness, the content of consciousness in in various of its configurations, is obviously a risk, or represents a risk, to philosophy that has been steeped in the liberal tradition and has given great weight to the fact that the autonomous subject is driven by an a priori of liberty, insofar as their moral and social conduct is concerned. Okay, so there's this tension, between the unconscious and between freedom of choice or free will that is central to structuralism, and structuralism will then apply discontinuity to examine the conditions of emergence of this configuration, specifically within philosophy itself. Michel Foucault will do that more specifically in his work, The Order of Things, Les Mots et les Choses, which is published in 1966. But also there are different interlocutions, we can say, between scholars who today are recognized as pioneers in the transformation of the human sciences, les sciences humaines, into the social sciences. For example, Claude Lévi-Strauss is certainly one of them, who is today recognized as an anthropologist and ethnologist, but had full training in philosophy and Durkheimian sociology at the beginning of his career, and as well as Louis Althusser, who mistakenly is seen as more of a political thinker instead of a philosopher, and this coming really from the Anglo-American tradition, over-interpreting what the context was of the nature of French philosophy, which always was, in a certain sense, quite multidisciplinary, certainly from the Enlightenment onwards, the 18th century onwards. It's characterized by authors working in science and economics and literature, as well as the modern philosophy as passed down since at least Descartes, and since the European Renaissance. So you have structuralism here dealing with comparative methodology, but introducing a comparativist method that would focus on differences much more than similarities. I mean, in a nutshell, this is what we can say that structuralism does. But given that there's no prior model by which to understand this comparativist methodology, what structuralism does also is to examine the formal sciences for possible models by which to understand the emergence of the human sciences, les sciences humaines, the humanities, and explain also whether, in fact, we are moving on to a new period, a period that would be considered as beyond that in which man, and I emphasize here, man was the central category. Right? So structuralism until 68 will seek formal models to give insight into what may be the transformation process opening on to a post-humanist period. Okay? These terms, post-humanism and much less post-structuralism, are not present in Manifesto for Philosophy. What we find in the first chapter of Manifesto for Philosophy is rather the outcome of a fundamental change that occurs in the 68 period. And that's that all of a sudden the formal sciences are abandoned as possible general maps, or what used to be called at least ontologies of the way the sciences, the experimental sciences and the social sciences are transformed socially with changing social times as well. And the sciences, let's say, or the discourses of contemporary art, including cinema, Lacanian and post-Lacanian psychoanalysis, and a radical organizational principle by which the political began to reorganize itself in the wake of 68, become these fuzzy, formal models by which to attempt not just to determine whether there was change, substituting the term revolution by that of event to refer to 68, clearly confirms that the generation, the post-68 generation, were absolutely convinced that something major had occurred. Okay? So instead of proving it by means of formal models, one was already into the open space of transformation, and the attempt was to follow it, to contribute to it, to share with it, to be transformed as well, and to allow the recent discoveries to take effect on who the human organism believes it is. Because if there's something that occurs is a reversal of dynamic forces happening. Let's just point to Chomskyan linguistics. No longer is language simply composed of words and sense and pragmatically verified modulations and applications of syntax. No, Chomskyan linguistics will put syntax first and identify the operation of the language faculty from which certain effects, such as rational thought, are made possible. So we're really very much into this period that an American philosopher calls the linguistic turn, whereby language, either in terms of language itself, although rarely is it language in terms of communicational language, is what is seen as producing thought. Okay, this is a turnaround from what existed since the modern period in philosophy, whereby thought is the entity or the faculty that made use of the tool of language to express itself. Okay, so we get into this period that begins in the 1970s, stretches into the 1980s, and then in the course of the 1980s, suddenly we find ourselves with a general impression that philosophy itself has been completely transformed. So one of the great effects of the transformational process that is initiated with 68 affects philosophy itself. And although it's not immediately identified, one can say that it's immediately worked on. And there are different operations that begin to characterize philosophy, going from its absorption of German thought. We have the presence of a number of German philosophers being discussed and being reevaluated from the problems identified by French philosophers. We can see also a question of the political. And we can particularly see the confirmation of what was already suspected by the structuralist philosophers and structuralist scientists, whereby the Cartesian notion of subject was no longer pertinent, and no longer was it relevant to mapping such a thing as thought. There would have to be another concept. So this is where we get into the consequences of the post-humanist moment. But through the 1980s, what Badiou will pick up and start to list in the first chapter of the Manifesto is that philosophy itself has entered into its decline. Philosophy has become stagnant, meaning that it's become basically an academic field. And the whole experimentation of the Vincennes, the new Vincennes Experimental Center, Research Center, which will become a university in the course of the 1980s, but is basically comprised of many of the leading structuralist philosophers and students of the structuralist philosophers, proves the point. There is a complete redesigning of the undergraduate training in the social sciences, for example, in philosophy. Not to mention a break with the institutional accreditation of the diplomas system. Right? So, stagnant. But as you can also see in chapter 1, there is a conviction that philosophy has been corrupted, philosophy has been co-opted by malevolent forces, particularly in the political realm. I can't really comment in detail about what the reasons are for which Badiou takes the tone that he does in the second part of chapter 1. It would be too long, but it is important to perceive that in the second part of the 1970s, there is the beginning of what Badiou will confirm in the 1980s as being the Restoration. Meaning the Restoration in France refers to the restoration of the monarchy, right, after the fall of Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, in the second part of the 1970s, you have an emergence of a group called the Nouveaux Philosophes. The Nouveaux Philosophes are France's version of the neocons. And the Nouveaux Philosophes will participate in incubating a whole series of books and studies on the big thinkers whose ideas came to circulate in 68 and after 68, and issue calls to reject these philosophers. Okay? Now, what also occurs at that time concomitantly, and it seems to be a type of, inversely related proportionality, I mean, the more the neocons, the Nouveaux Philosophes, and the anti-May 68 thinkers emerge, the less philosophy's role in emancipatory politics is recalled and worked on, and the more philosophy is seen to be part and parcel of a totalitarian attitude. Okay? It's important to note that in the 1970s, one can really spot the activation of this term that was invented more or less by Hannah Arendt. And that's also why the French Marxian left is very resistant to accepting Arendt's genius, let's say, at that time. So this is the gist of what Badiou presents, although he presents it in the terms very present at the time, and in the conflictual spirit that existed at the time, and that from time to time reappears in the context of political movements in France. I would simply recommend looking at his debate with Alain Finkielkraut to get more information on what the circumstances were in the 1980s that led Badiou to immediately position himself in this way. Now, in the second chapter, Conditions, we already get Badiou's rebuttal to the possibility that philosophy had exhausted itself, that had entered into a dispersion and had basically overextended its use. There are institutional questions also behind that, the changing nature of the philosophical curriculum and the diminishing prestige of philosophy as a course by which to train the new generation of cadres of the civil service in France. But regardless, Badiou brings in chapter 2, in the first couple of lines, a position that is absolutely worth reading. He says that philosophy has begun. It does not exist within all historic configurations. Its way of being is discontinuous, or is discontinuity in time as in space. It must thus be presupposed that it requires particular conditions. So we see Badiou immediately questioning what are the conditions behind the critical positions about philosophy that are taken by his colleagues and expressed in the first chapter of the book. These conditions will acquire extreme importance in the reconfiguration of what Badiou understands to be philosophy, and they're truly deserving of some attention at this specific moment, because it is through the empirical verification of the conditions that Badiou will be led to question why it is, or rather how it is, that his colleagues may have come to the understanding that philosophy was in its decline. That's because philosophy, since its Greek moment, let's say, has been mainly concentrated around three pillars, right? One would be the question of being qua being. So being as the object of its most formal sub-science or subdivision, which is ontology, but the endpoint to all serious philosophical endeavors is to create an ontology. Right? So an ontology is the science of being qua being. It has different senses, different meanings, but it crosses philosophy from the Greeks to the Romans, to the medieval Roman Catholics, and the subsequently Orthodox Christians, to the Arabs and the Andalusians, and back into Europe at the time of the Renaissance, or shortly before. So we have these, we have being, we have also truth, and we have the entity that carries thought, that expresses thought. That could be mind, if you like. It could also be spirit. The French tend to call it subject, ever since and due to Descartes' work on the topic. And then philosophy also has identified one of its main vocations to be that of thinking the truth, even postulating truth as being absolute, which is something that we recognize as part of Platonism and Neoplatonism, and also as part of the radical, dramatic critique mounted by Nietzsche against Plato. So Badiou's position is here regarding whether to keep philosophy or not is based on historical tradition, and but also in empirical verification. That we can see that when philosophy has existed, it has dealt with these notions. Now, these notions. So, the philosophy is truly at its end. One strategy to take in order to really determine whether this is the case is to examine how philosophy may have emerged. This is, in fact, part of the actions of most significant philosophers when they reach a certain type of status in their philosophical oeuvre, is to give an account of the origins of philosophy. We can see this in Foucault, we can see this in Nietzsche and Heidegger, we can see this in the philosophers who become the great Hellenists in the French tradition, like Jean-Pierre Vernant. Some will choose the pre-Socratics, others will choose Plato, Socrates, Plato for the British, the tragedians for Verdun. What Badiou is interested in locating is how it is that philosophy became interested in these topics, in these concepts, in these main concepts. And from his evaluation when examining the state of Greek arts at the time that Plato emerges, is that there is a constant examination of the specificities, the philosophical, the conceptual specificities related to at least four areas of thought that work as conditions to the emergence of Plato's philosophy. So these are the political, as we can see, for example, in the Republic. Love, as can be seen either in the Philebus or the Symposium. The sciences in general, whether it be in the Phaedrus, in the Meno, in the Republic once again, or in the Theaetetus. And then the arts, which are also spread out in the different mythologies created, but particularly in the moral dimension to which art must adapt, as spelt out in the Republic, or once again in the Phaedrus. So Badiou will identify various conditions here of activity as already existing prior to Plato's oeuvre. So we can see already this effect of the changing relationships, because let it be said that until the mid-19th century, philosophy still maintained itself as, let's say, the main source of new knowledge, as the queen of sciences, as the matrix of all the sciences. Right? So philosophy existed as an adjudicator of what new sciences were proposing, as well as the memory of the shape in which the newly mathematized sciences once were expressed when they were part of philosophy. So here we have a vision on the transformation of philosophy triggered by some of Hegel's perceptions, and particularly about the owl of Minerva and how philosophy takes flight only after the event has occurred. So we already have the working of event on this new conception of philosophy that believes itself to be at its end, and yet which expresses some of the clues to its possible resurgence. And some of these clues are given by means of the conditions. What are the conditions? Why do the conditions interest philosophy? Specifically, because they are the space in which truths are produced. So the task of philosophy then will be to verify this claim and to examine empirically and historically how these truths do emerge. And as we can see, we're in a backward type of recursive critical motion, a certain type of hermeneutic circle, if you like, meaning that from one discovery, we're moving subsequently to the previous one, meaning that if philosophy is declared to be at its end, well, let us question, how did it emerge in the first place? Is philosophy absolute? No, it emerged under specific circumstances. Those circumstances are mediated by the conditions. Why are the conditions of interest to philosophy? Because they are the space in which truths are produced. Now, how can we be certain that truths are produced? What is our criteriology to determine whether truths are produced? Well, every truth also has a starting point. This will be a key notion to Badiou's philosophy. Why is this the case? Well, because every new thinking system begins from a starting point. I'm not deliberately avoiding the use of terms like history or birth but you can see, for those of you who have read Martin Heidegger, for example, why he doesn't use the term birth and he prefers the term thrownness. Here, what triggers the emergence of the new truth is, in fact, the meaning that Badiou will give to the concept of event. Okay? So the conditions are not voluntarily designated terms. What are the fields that have given most of philosophy in its interaction? No. The conditions are the circumstances, the specific circumstances by which philosophy arises. Okay? And why is that the case? Because one finds a relationship in these specific conditions between truth and event. The event as the triggering point or the triggering dynamic of a truth that thus can be said to be new, given that the event is or represents or names a discontinuity. A discontinuity where? A discontinuity within the state of the situation, the state of affairs, the state of normality, the state of law. Now, how will truth be brought to an event? Well, that's the constitutive role of what, within the new configuration of philosophy, will be called the generic subject. So basically, we've gotten up to, more or less halfway of Manifesto for philosophy. So I would recommend making sure that your reading is done to follow me up until this point. But at any rate, the next session will be devoted to the second part of Manifesto for Philosophy. Once again, I don't really plan on making any diagrams, even using Badiou's diagrams. All I would like to do is explain in the most simple of terms possible what is going on here in this philosophical system and why it is that the French context serves us well to understand that this is a philosophical system that requires thought of diversity and multiplicity to be active constantly, because philosophy will only emerge in its history, or it can be said to emerge in its history, only provided that these four conditions coexist, even though their respective understanding of what the truth is may be completely contrary or even contradictory or even denied by the others. There we find the meaning of compossibility, meaning that the four truth conditions have to be in existence compossibly for philosophy to emerge. And this is something that can be verified through the history of philosophy. Now, verified to a certain degree, and philosophy will not be said ever by Badiou to always exist. Discontinuity, as I read before, discontinuity is what describes it. So that means that it certainly is not the first time that philosophy has faded away, nor is it the last one. But therefore, there must be some even more concrete reasons for which philosophy may have been disappearing in the 1980s. And this is where Badiou will introduce his notion of suture. That will be kept for next time to explain. Thank you for attending Philosophizing with Alain Badiou. I'm Norman Madaras. If you've enjoyed this episode, do leave your like, register or subscribe to the station, share this video, and feel free to consult the links that I leave on the information bubble, in which you can find some of my published work, or simply my email if you wish to send me a question regarding what is certainly a monumental system. But we're only starting here. And the name of the game here to understand the system is patience, because there will be many opportunities where the system will be presented completely according to Popperian criteria. So you will be able to raise objections and perhaps even articulate a refutation, but a refutation has to be confirmed by the other side, right? So this is the beginning. Next time, the second part of the Manifesto for Philosophy. See you then.